Well, buckle up because the Ripple, the XRP and SEC story just threw us another curveball.
Oh, definitely.
You saw the news, right?
Yeah.
Judge Torres denied the motion for an indicative ruling on their proposed settlement.
Yeah.
Honestly, just when you thought you had a handle on things.
It certainly keeps us on our toes, doesn't it? It looked like a smooth landing was pretty close, and now we've hit a bit of unexpected turbulence.
Okay, so let's dissect this because I know many of you following this are probably feeling a bit like, trying to decipher ancient hieroglyphics.
Mm.
Our mission today is pretty straightforward. We need to understand what this denial actually means for this whole legal back and forth, what it could mean for XRP's future, and importantly, let's try to dial down any of the panic that might be floating around.
Yeah, cut through the noise a bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've been looking at some recent analyses, especially on YouTube, to bring you the key takeaways.
And the very first thing to get clear on is exactly what Judge Torres ruled on. She didn't say no deal to the settlement itself. What she rejected was the motion for what's called an indicative ruling.
So an indicative ruling, that's like asking the judge for a sneak peek of her opinion before officially filing, right? Kind of a heads up.
Exactly. Think of it as asking for a thumbs up or thumbs down on the general direction before finalizing all the paperwork.
Okay.
And in this case, she said it was procedurally improper. That's the crucial phrase here.
Procedurally improper.
Yeah. So what does that actually mean for the rest of us?
Right. It sounds very official, but what's the everyday translation?
Basically, because Ripple dropped part of their appeal, the legal playing field sort of shifted.
No.
And the way they needed to ask the judge to approve the settlement changed. So given the court's current jurisdictional status after that cross-appeal dismissal, she's signaling that she wouldn't give that preliminary approval to the settlement motion as it was presented.
So it's less about the substance of the settlement itself and more about them using the wrong legal doorway, maybe.
Yeah.
Like trying to pay with euros at a store that only takes dollars. Is that fair?
That's actually a helpful analogy. It's a denial of the specific legal steps they took.
Right.
To get the settlement formally approved at this particular moment, they might just need to, resubmit using the correct process.
Got it. Okay. Now, as you might expect, the market had a bit of a wobble.
Mm-hmm. Predictable.
We saw XRP take a bit of a dip, around 5% or so in the day after this news dropped. But what did Ripple themselves have to say to try and calm the waters?
Well, Ripple's chief legal officer, Stu Alderati, he was quick to share their perspective, and it's quite informative, actually.
Okay.
He emphasized that, quote, nothing in today's order changes Ripple's win, i.e. XRP is not a security.
Right, sticking to their guns on the main point.
Exactly. He framed this whole thing as a procedural concern with the dismissal of Ripple's cross-appeal.
Which really underscores that they still feel their fundamental win, the clarity around XRP itself not being a security is, solid.
Yep.
And importantly, Alderati also mentioned that Ripple and the SEC are still on the same page about wanting to resolve this.
Right.
And plan to work together to figure out the right way to approach the court now.
And that's the key takeaway for anyone feeling anxious about this. The initial fear, I think, was that the whole settlement had just fallen apart.
Yeah, that the deal was off.
Right. But it seems the agreement to settle is still there. It's the formal process of getting the court's stamp of approval that's hit this snag.
Okay, so let's really get into the weeds of these procedural issues then.
Yeah.
What could have been the misstep in their filing? What are people saying?
Well, from what analysts are saying, the likely issue has to do with how Ripple and the SEC were trying to finalize the settlement, considering Judge Torres' earlier rulings.
Okay.
Specifically regarding the injunction that order about how Ripple could sell XRP and the fine she had initially suggested.
Ah, right. The fine and the injunction were still kind of hanging in the air, even after the initial rulings on whether XRP was a security. Correct.
Exactly. When Ripple decided not to pursue the cross-appeal, it changed the legal landscape, particularly concerning those remedies Judge Torres had already put in place. It seems they can't just agree to a settlement that might contradict or, change those existing orders without following a specific legal procedure to address them properly.
So it's like trying to, file for a divorce after the initial separation agreement has already been signed. The next steps require a different process. Is that kind of it?
That's a pretty good way to think about it, yeah. The context changed, so the required steps changed too.
So Judge Torres had already laid out a potential fine amount and a specific type of injunction, and the settlement they agreed on likely proposes something different.
That appears to be the heart of the matter, yes. They needed to find the correct legal mechanism to either address or potentially modify Judge Torres's previous orders.
And they missed.
And their initial motion seems to have missed the mark, procedurally speaking.
Okay. Now, this injunction piece has been a real focal point throughout this whole saga. What's the current understanding of what Judge Torres actually ruled there? Because there was some confusion.
There was. And the critical point to understand is that Judge Torres's original ruling on the injunction was very specific. It focused on how Ripple sold XRP to institutional investors.
Just the how.
Yes, it wasn't a blanket prohibition on them selling to institutions altogether.
Okay, so it was about the specific method they used. That method was deemed problematic, not the act of selling to institutions itself.
Precisely. Here's an analogy that might help. Judge Torres essentially said to Ripple, you can't take this particular road to the store, meaning that specific way of selling to institutions was deemed an unregistered security offering.
Okay, that road's closed.
Right. But that doesn't mean they can't go to the store at all. They just might need to find a different route.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
So Ripple could potentially tweak how they sell to these big institutional players and still be within the bounds of her original ruling.
Absolutely. And here's where it gets really interesting, actually. It seems both Ripple and the SEC now agree that the specific way Ripple sold XRP to institutions previously was not a security, despite Judge Torres's earlier ruling on that particular method.
Wait, hold on. So in a somewhat convoluted way, both the defendant and the prosecution are now essentially saying the judge might have gotten that specific point wrong.
That's a fair and pretty accurate way to put it, yeah.
Wow, okay.
And this is why the procedural aspect is so crucial. They need to reconcile this shared understanding with the court's existing order in the correct legal way.
This brings up an interesting angle about Judge Torres herself. I mean, could her desire to stand by her previous rulings play any part in how this unfolds?
Yeah.
Is pride a factor here?
It's certainly something that gets discussed, in the commentary. Judges naturally have a degree of conviction in their own judgments. That's human.
Sure.
However, the ultimate goal is always to reach a legally sound conclusion. The general expectation is that while Judge Torres will absolutely want to ensure proper legal procedure is followed,
Right.
The injunction is still likely to be lifted eventually, especially given that Ripple and the SEC seem to be on the same page about the underlying issue now.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's shift gears now and look at what all this news did to the XRP price. We saw that initial dip. What's the story the price charts are telling us in the bigger picture?
Right. So while we did see that immediate reaction with the price dip, it's really important to look at the broader trend. XRP has actually been maintaining significantly higher price levels since, November of last year?
Okay.
What we're observing now looks like a test, a pretty significant support level.
And what makes this particular support level so important to watch right now? Why that level?
Well, this is roughly the same price range where XRP found solid footing after a pretty substantial price correction back in 2025.
Ah, okay, historical support.
Exactly. It dropped around 52% from its peak back then, but crucially, it held above that 40-cent mark, roughly.
Right. Every $1.40.
So the current price action appears to be a retest of this same support level after what looks like a reversal pattern had formed.
Okay, so if XRP can hold this level and then, bounce upwards, what are some of the potential targets analysts are talking about? Where could it go?
Well, some analysts are suggesting we could see a move towards the $3 mark if the support holds and bullish momentum returns.
$3, wow.
Yeah, this kind of retest of support after a breakout and reversal is often viewed as a pretty positive signal in technical analysis. Obviously no guarantees, but that's the setup.
Right, standard disclaimer applies. Now, looking beyond just the XRP chart itself, what other broader indicators in the crypto market should we be keeping an eye on? Things that affect everything.
The Bitcoin dominance chart is a really key indicator. You definitely want to watch that.
Explain that quickly.
It essentially shows you what percentage of the entire cryptocurrency market's value is held by Bitcoin.
Got it.
Right now, Bitcoin dominance has been in a strong upward trend since 2023 and is sitting at a pretty high level, around 63%.
63%. That's a big chunk of the pie.
It really is.
What are the long-term forecasts for Bitcoin dominance, and how might that impact XRP and, all the other cryptocurrencies?
Well, the long-term expectation from many in the field is that Bitcoin dominance is likely to decline, maybe even significantly in the coming years.
Really? Decline?
Yeah, potentially dropping below 25% by the end of this decade, some projections say.
Why is that?
The reasoning behind this is the increasing adoption and, crucially, the real-world utility of other cryptocurrencies, like XRP, for example.
So as the crypto market matures and we see more practical uses for different digital assets, Bitcoin's share of the overall market value is expected to shrink. It becomes less dominant.
Exactly. As more individuals and institutions begin to understand the potential of blockchain technology beyond just being a digital store of value.
Which is Bitcoin's main thing.
Right. Assets that offer real utility for payments, for smart contracts, you name it, like XRP, are positioned to capture a larger share of the market, especially with growing institutional interest.
That makes sense. It's kind of like the early days of the internet, right?
Yeah.
Initially, it was just about connecting computers, maybe email.
Yeah.
But then all sorts of applications and websites emerged, diversifying its use and its value enormously.
That's a great parallel, actually. And this anticipated decrease in Bitcoin dominance could create significant opportunities for the rest of the cryptocurrency market, including XRP.
Okay.
So while we're navigating this current period of, let's call it, uncertainty and these procedural hurdles,
Yeah, the turbulence.
it's worth remembering that this could just be part of being in the early stages, maybe even the ground floor of a much larger evolution in the market.
So to bring it all together then, what are the main things we should really remember from this deep dive today? The key points.
Okay, number one, the settlement between Ripple and the SEC is still on the table, it seems. It's just facing some procedural obstacles related to finalizing the agreement given previous court rulings.
Right, the paperwork's tricky.
Yeah. Number two, importantly, both Ripple and the SEC seem committed to finding a resolution. They're still talking.
Good sign.
And number three, while the price of XRP might see short-term volatility in response to news like this, its long-term prospects are still linked to its actual utility and the broader trends within the cryptocurrency market.
Like that Bitcoin dominance shift.
Exactly, particularly that expected shift away from Bitcoin's current dominance level.
That's a great way to summarize it. Thanks. And on that note, here's something to really chew on for all of you listening. What specific real-world applications of digital assets like XRP do you personally find the most compelling? And maybe think about how resolving regulatory uncertainties like this one, even with these bumps in the road, might ultimately pave the way for much wider adoption of this technology in our everyday lives.
Yeah, what does that future actually look like?
Exactly. It's definitely worth pondering the use cases and, of course, keeping a close watch on how the regulatory landscape continues to take shape. Thanks for diving deep with us today.